We do have a crisis of integrity where we see wide-scale abuse of power, wide-scale theft of resources in a variety of settings happening across the public sector and also within the private sector.
We really need to empower our law enforcement organizations. If we don't get this right, we're lost for sure.
Comrades, for our video on state capture, we interviewed a bunch of experts who told us some dope stuff that we didn't have space to include in our explainer. So now we're letting you in on the whole thing. This is the Politically Aweh podcast. Let's get away.
So just in sort of simple terms, what is the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council?
So the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council, I'll just call it the Council or the Advisory Council, is a 9-member presidential advisory council, as the name implies. We are appointed by the president, and our role is to advise him and his cabinet on the effective implementation of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy, the NACS, which is South Africa's plan for fighting corruption and reclaiming our country from state capture.
What powers does the council have?
So we don't have any public powers per se. However, we are enabled to access and engage the various stakeholders to help us to fulfill our mandate. And then when we hand over our advisories to the president, those advisories are then up to him and his administration to then consider and implement as makes sense within the administration of government.
So just explain to me a little bit some of the work that NAC's done, especially now with the progress of implementing this on the Commission's recommendations.
To get things moving really takes a big effort that requires everyone to be moving almost in unison in a common direction. And so the NACS, the strategy, really represents our collective aspirations in this regard. It was developed over a multi-year process and through a process that was called the National Anti-Corruption Strategy Reference Group, right? There was representation from civil society, from government, from the private sector, the faith community, trade unions, and so forth, co-led by civil society and government. In our engagements with the various social partners, what really came up is that in order to fight corruption, there are specific capabilities that are required in terms of the law enforcement aspects of corruption busting. We have, all of these law enforcement organizations that are all in one way or another engaged in corruption investigations. And then the public education functions that really help us to build the culture of probity that we need in our society, the ethics, the honesty. Now, these functions need to be thought about in a very practical sort of way, ranging from how to start embedding the strategy through all levels of government, all the way to what is required to address the relationship between party funding, the exercise of public power, and corruption. There's ongoing work that's happening to frame appropriate interim and long-term relief measures that protect whistleblowers from violence and victimization, because whistleblowers are central to helping us root out corruption. We also have been doing a little bit of work to secure and build the resilience of our public procurement system.
Can you give me any specific examples then of what has been put in place there to deal with those issues?
So our job is not to put in place, but to advise, right? At this moment, the advisories have not been published just yet because they still are they're still being processed by the president. Once they've been processed through the presidency, and we hope that this will happen quite soon, then they will be published.
Quite a few frustrations and things that people have mentioned was why is everything so slow? Why does it take so long for everything to sort of be put in place? Which areas of anti-corruption reform have been most difficult to sort of wrap your head around finding solutions for or tackling?
The first, I would say, is really about rebuilding and scaling the expertise, the capacity and coordination in our law enforcement institutions to be able to catch these guys, to build strong cases against them, to take back our money, and significantly to secure the lengthy convictions that we need in order to have that deterrent effect that corruption does not pay. Because frankly, at the moment, given the limitations and the context in which we are in, it kind of is paying, and that's not something that we want to continue. And really, I just want to say that if we don't get this right, we're lost for sure. The second thing that has really been quite difficult to tackle has really been the issue of how we go about securing our public procurement system, which, again, from the State Capture Commission, we learned that this is really where the greatest extent of our systemic corruption problem lies. And this has serious and material consequences for the overwhelming majority of our people who depend on the delivery of public goods and services. Right now, there's a whole process underway to once again reform the Procurement Act.
Do you think then that we, as a society, South African society, can sort of weed out this culture of corruption that generally sort of exists among us?
Yes, absolutely. Right. But it's going to take all of us, because we've got to remember that, number one, corruption is a team sport, right? If we go back to just that definition of what state capture is, it's a type of systemic political corruption in which private interests significantly influence or shape a state's decision-making processes to their own advantage. So this requires people in the political system working with private interests, so that's people in the private sector, big business, right, as well as your SMMEs. So commensurately, we're going to need a team response. We're going to need an active citizenry, right, that is really invested in building a culture of probity everywhere. This is in our homes, it's in our schools, it's in our places of work, be it in the public and private sector, and everywhere that people come together. Because here's the other thing, systemic corruption. It's made possible not so much by a few bad apples who have access to power, but by social values that translate into norms that get institutionalized in the system. If the norms and values are that, we don't cause trouble here, then it's going to embed a culture, an expectation of getting away with it when we do it. Thanks for having me.
Let's just jump into speaking about corruption itself. What do you sort of see as the root of what we've sort of accepted as a culture of corruption in South Africa?
I think it's a combination of factors. There are elements of the economic system and the political system which drive people into corruption. I think, in terms of living in a democracy, we can ask questions about how resilient is our democracy. It hasn't shown a real resiliency, despite having put some structures in place, like the public protector and others. The scale of the potential kind of endemic corruption wasn't envisioned by the governance framework that was set up by the Constitution. So there are additional safeguards and protections that we need to future-proof the state from corruption. I think the last issue is then this issue around the culture of corruption and the kind of crisis of integrity. So, we understand corruption to be the abuse of entrusted power or resources by anyone for private gain. And what we have is we do have a crisis of integrity where we see wide-scale abuse of power, wide-scale theft of resources in a variety of settings happening across the public sector and also within the private sector.
And then just sort of from Corruption Watch's research and work, what are some of the sort of key areas where corruption is worst in our country? In
terms of the complaints that we've seen coming in over the years, historically, one of the big vulnerable areas has been the police. But we also see across social services corruption challenges in the healthcare sector, in education, in social grants, basically across the system. One of the big areas of vulnerability is the public procurement system. The government is one of the big players in the economy, and they're one of the most significant procurer of goods and services. And we find that there's lots of vulnerabilities within the public procurement system where some of the big money gets looted. And one of the things we've spoken about in terms of reforming that is ensuring that the public procurement system is more transparent, and that when there are findings of wrongdoings by service providers, that those service providers are effectively blacklisted. And that system doesn't work that well at the moment.
Just talking about service providers, things like issues of service delivery, what are some other ways that corruption just affects the man on the street?
If the man in the street is, somehow reliant upon government services, reliant upon, receiving electricity, reliant upon ensuring that there's safety in the community, that the children are getting a good education at school, that if they get sick, that they'll be able to be treated at the hospital without any irregular payments. These are the circumstances where people are really vulnerable and where they oftentimes experience corruption, at the coalface of service delivery, which is why we talk about those being hotspot areas. We just have to think as a country about the challenge of load shedding and how Eskom, over a period of time went from being a viable, well-run, if not profit-making entity to basically being an entity riddled with corruption challenges that has a basic inability to deliver on its mandate.
And then now kind of looking into things like state capture as sort of the biggest example of corruption that we have in our country. The Zondo Commission, do you think that it was sort of a waste of time, as some people have said? And do you think things like commissions of inquiry actually work?
What I would say in response to that frustration is that we needed the Zondo Commission to be able to provide us with a historical record about what happened. If it wasn't for the Zondo Commission, we would still be in the realm of allegations, of stories, of a lot of evidence which wasn't necessarily verified. We wouldn't have a clear picture or diagnostic about what happened, who was responsible, and what needs to happen to fix it. So if we look at the democratic history of South Africa, from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission through to the Marikana Commission through to the Zondo Commission, we have this challenge where the commission functions well. The commission is able to make really competent findings and recommendations almost as a result of a kind of forensic intervention, but then there's no real accountability that flows from it. And I think that's what we really need to think about going forward before we make these kinds of investments into commissions of inquiry. What could be a better mechanism?
And I mean, often we just kind of want to point fingers somewhere. So with sort of that need for people to point a finger, do you feel that now under Ramaphosa and the 6th administration, that enough is being done to turn the tide on corruption? One, with implementing the recommendations of the commission, as you've mentioned earlier, and then two, with improving accountability within the ANC, the ruling party.
I don't think we can say that we are satisfied on either score, that the administration has effectively implemented recommendations or that the governing party has effectively cleaned house. We've seen that now again with the party lists which have come out and the challenges around implicated persons and the application of the step-aside rule. There's still some confusion around this, and it's not clear that it's functioned in a way that would be satisfying to the public. We want to see implicated persons either put through a process or certainly disqualified until they're able to clear their name. There is a lot of work being done around implementation of Zondo Commission recommendations. There is draft legislation which is snaking its way through Parliament. There are different types of initiatives. We have seen key institutions of state that were captured, like SARS and the NPA, kind of reconstitute themselves. And they wouldn't have been able to do that without the support and the backing of the administration. But, this 6th administration came in on an anti-corruption ticket. It came in on the basis that we were going to turn a corner. And unfortunately, we've continued to see big corruption scandals. In terms of the cases which have been enrolled by the NPA following the Zondo Commission, there is some real concern about the capacity of the NPA, their track record to effectively drive these cases to successful prosecutions. And until that happens, we'll continue to have these doubts and question marks.
Will we see some key players from state capture actually behind bars?
I would like to think it would happen. I'd like to think that there's enough evidence to pursue these cases, but they're complex. Nobody says that the NPA has an easy job. Some of the offenses that they're trying to prove, the chain of evidence that they're relying upon, all of these things need to be tested. We're fortunate to have an independent judiciary, so it's very difficult to prejudge. But certainly there's an expectation that there will be some successful prosecutions. There have to be.
Just to empower the ordinary citizen, what can I do as a South African to combat corruption in my day-to-day life?
We often talk about the active citizenry and the fact that we all have a role to play. Individually, we need to resist corruption as it may pop up in our daily lives so that we don't engage in corrupt practices, particularly when it comes to paying bribes to public officials. We must resist that. We must call out corruption when we see it. We must blow the whistle. And as communities, we must also circle the wagon around human rights defenders and whistleblowers to ensure that, that they're protected. It's very difficult to encourage whistleblowing in a context where we know that whistleblowers' lives are often, put into danger. They lose their jobs. They face financial challenges. We won't win the fight against corruption if we don't have an enhanced whistleblower protection system. And I think it's also then just critical for us to just be, really informed, and particularly informed at a local level in terms of what's going on in our municipalities, that it does the right thing, and delivers on its mandate in a way which is corruption-free.
Okay, those are all my questions for you. Thank you so much for your time, Karam.
Okay, thank you so much.